Good afternoon. Welcome to Ditokello Tsa Hao. My name is Tshepo Ngoato, and today we're going to be talking about the Law and Human Rights Charter. But before that, please make sure that you follow us on all social media platforms. Our call to action number is 067-267-3103. And today we are joined by Mr. Kimani Ndungu, who is a legal profession, and he actually has been a lawyer for the past decade. And how are you, sir?
I'm fine, Tshepo. How are you?
I'm extremely well. How's your day?
It's been a busy day. I was in court this morning, and I spent most of my time in court in a matter before a judge here in Johannesburg. But it was okay. It's what I do on a daily basis.
When you're saying that, can you kindly tell us a bit about yourself? Because I may know a bit about you, but the audience don't.
Thank you so much. I've got quite a long history, but I will chunk it. I think we would spend the next 1 year if I have to tell my whole story. I am of Kenyan origin. I moved to this country while I was still fairly young in 1998, and I stayed. And I haven't left ever since, so there's something very good about the country. Initially, I studied for a law degree at the University of Nairobi, which I finished in 1996. And I had issues with my government, which then led me to flee from the country. And then I came to South Africa. Let me just shorten it to, I went to UCT a year after my arrival, 2 years after my arrival in South Africa, and I did a master's degree there. And then later on, I did an LLB degree at UNISA, which I finished in about 2011. But in between there at Tshepo, I worked for lots of organizations. I worked for the National Association of Democratic Lawyers. I also worked for the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. I worked for the Human Rights Commission. I worked for COSATU for many, many years as a head of research. So I've been around. I have seen my fair bit in this lovely country.
And it looks like you have got so much preference of experience that you had in the communities, probably.
I worked, most of the work was in a way with communities, because except maybe for COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the rest of the work was with NGOs. And with those NGOs, for instance, I worked for the Freedom of Expression Institute for 3 years, just over 3 years. And we did a lot of work with communities. I traveled around the country doing community radio evaluation and doing community radio training. So a lot of my work has been with communities. And a lot of that work with the NGOs was on human rights.
Speaking about that, I just wanted to find out again, because I hear that you have been doing a lot of work with human rights violations, probably. And what are the type of cases that probably you may have been picking up around violations, mostly around key pops? Because we know that in South Africa we've got a high rate of key pops, and probably also in Kenya. And what are the type of violations that probably you have found out that you?
Well, currently in my practice, I've been a lawyer since 2017. I practice under Ndungu attorneys, but a lot of my work is with immigration matters, so refugees and migrants. I also deal with a lot of labor law cases, a bit of family law, so children and maintenance and divorce matters. But it was in my previous role working with NGOs that we work with vulnerable populations. For a while I worked for the Foundation for Human Rights, and FHR, which is, it's known as FHR for short, is one of the leading local funders of NGO and human rights work in the country. So in that regard, we basically dealt with everyone you can imagine as vulnerable populations, rather. So women, children, migrants, LGBTQI, all those kinds of groups. I haven't myself directly dealt with any case in court involving vulnerable populations or key populations, because that's not my area of speciality. But I have worked quite closely with institutions that dealt with those populations. For instance, we would know there was what we used to call the AIDS Law Project well before the Treatment Action Campaign. We had quite a bit of interaction with them. And then the TAC. In fact, when the TAC was launched in 1998, I was in Cape Town in those days. And I became acquainted with some of the leaders of the TAC. And later, when the TAC was campaigning for antiretrovirals and accessibility of HIV and AIDS medication, we were quite involved. At that time, I was working for the for the Freedom of Expression Institute. But yes, I still do engage with institutions like HURISA, the Human Rights Institute of South Africa. And when they bring up cases, sometimes they'll talk to me about just even in an advisory capacity.
You talked a bit about the work that you've done with the TAC. And we know probably like within the violations within that, how has the improvements between then and now? Because we know that each and every year there is always a violations probably, yeah.
I think it's hard, Tshepo, to, in a way, put numbers on or figures on how things were then and how things are now. But one thing that I can say is that we had a lot of activism in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And I don't get that feel anymore. It doesn't mean that it's not happening. I think it is there. There are lots of wonderful NGOs that are doing this kind of work. But I also suppose that given our constitution and its protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, including the right to health, that there is a much greater degree of awareness of these rights. So it may be the case that one may not be familiar with the happenings on the ground, but there are communities that have taken up the struggles. There are institutions that I'm aware of, and you might come to, like SANAC and others, which activate or which are activists in a way in the protection of these particular rights. So again, although it's difficult to put numbers or to put trends, there is still a lot of work that's happening on the ground.
And speaking about that, SANAC and Human Rights has just launched the Human Rights Charter in June in the TB conference. And what are your views pertaining that, which we know that it's not really out there as in yet? And what are your views pertaining the Human Rights Charter that was launched?
It's an important document because it seeks to capture the essence and the commitment of government, civil society, and society broadly, and all the parties in the protection and the advancement of rights of all individuals, and in particular what you probably know as the key populations. And these are groups of people who, by virtue of who they are or their conditions in life, face major difficulties or challenges in enjoying their rights. But a charter is as good as the work that can be put into it. So having a charter is only part of it. It's actually just a beginning. Ensuring that charter is implemented is a much more important work, in my view. And I would suppose that for all those parties that participated in the launch of the charter, there is a program of action. And I'm more familiar with maybe the traditional ways of doing things, the activism. For instance, way back in 2001, when we had the World Conference Against Racism, which was a UN event, major event in Durban. There were the documents that came out of that conference, but then we had the countries themselves put into place specific programs for the implementation of those key decisions. And the same thing has to apply to the Charter.
What would you think it will literally benefit the community? Because we know that in every actions that we do, it has to benefit the community in some way.
We need to get down there. We need institutions like SANAC, Show Me Your Number, other human rights organizations. We need these institutions to take the charter and to decentralize that charter, to take it to the communities, to simplify. I mean, the language of the charter is fairly simple, but let's remember that not everyone speaks the language that you find in the charter. An important question to ask would be, has the charter been translated into our 11 official languages, for instance? Because what percentage of our population speaks English? You know, even if it may be 30, 40 odd percent, we still have about another half or 60, 70% of our population that may not understand that language. So we need to have a clear and well thought program of publicizing the charter, popularizing the charter, and involving communities so that there is buy-in. Without buy-in, the charter then remains as any document. It just becomes a written document without purpose or meaning to the majority of people.
And what I'm hearing is that we are trying to run away from just writing documents, because I know within the past years we have so many documents that are written and we have not taken actions. But within this charter that has just been launched, how well do you think we can sustain it?
First, let's look at what the charter seeks to or aims to achieve. And the aim is to ensure that the rights of everyone are realized. The rights of key and vulnerable populations are realized. And if you think about those particular rights, for instance, let's take the right to health. The right to health is a constitutional right. It's in Section 27 of our Constitution. It says we are all entitled to health, basic health, and that includes reproductive health care. But then the same Constitution in the same section says that the state, meaning our country, there's a difference between the state and government. Government is the people we elect to power. State means our country, South Africa. So the Constitution says that the state must take action, progressive measures to realize the right to health. And that is where the challenge comes in, Tshepo. Because the state will always say they don't have enough money. And as much as we may want everyone to say access antiretroviral medication, all TB medication, or any other medication, and I'm just using health as one example. When an old man or woman from one of our rural places goes to the local clinic, are they able to access the medication that they need? If they go there and they cannot get that medication, that is a violation of their right. So the Constitution may give us a right, and the Charter may come and say, these are the commitments, these are the principles, these are the commitments. But it is in the delivery of that medication to that old woman or man, or to that pregnant woman, or even pregnant, young mothers, or even children who have a right to basic health care. It is in the delivery of that medication that we can actually make the Charter to be effective. So I see the Charter as a living document, but it is a document into which we must breathe life.
You speak so profoundly about the history that has been happening for the past decades right now, and we slowly talked about how you envision the Charter and literally benefit community members. But I think it will also be best for us to be able to unpack the Charter, the both of us here, because I think we may talk about it, but what's the context that is within the Charter that majority of people in the community don't know about it? Because it's good to talk about it, but not unpacking it does not make any feedback within the community. Is it okay? We can unpack it, right?
Yes, certainly. So if you look at the Charter broadly, it's got two main legs, or two main heads, for lack of a better word. So it's got the themes. Those are the key human rights that the Charter speaks about. And then it's got a section That is a call to action. So the first part of the charter is about which are these rights that we're talking about? How do we define those rights? How do we understand those rights? And what is it that we want to happen with those rights? And we can pick a few of those rights. For instance, the right to health. The Charter says everyone is entitled to adequate health care. But let's look at our country now. We have a health system that is very skewed in the sense that there is a private healthcare system that is first world. And I use that term with all the emphasis that it carries. In other words, if you have the money and can afford Discovery or MedShield or whoever else is out there giving private medical insurance, you will have access to the best healthcare the world can offer. And that is in our country. I'm not talking about the United States or Europe or Australia. I'm talking about this very country. If you don't have the money, Tshepo, chances are you'll end up at the local public clinic, the health clinic, that is the first level. And if the health clinic in your community cannot treat you, they probably will refer you to a hospital like Helen Joseph or any other hospital around, in the case of Johannesburg. If you compare the resourcing in those two different healthcare institutions, the private and the public, they are very different. And that's why government wants to introduce the National Health Care System, NHI, National Health Insurance. There are good and fundamental principles why we need the NHI. So that you, I, and everybody else, irrespective of our social status and economic standing, we can get proper medical health care. That is the idea. So that is what the Charter, in certain ways, aims to give effect to. And that's just at the level of healthcare. Obviously, there are other rights which you may want us to have a brief discussion about.
Within the healthcare system, we've got a lot of loops here and there. But now, the most important thing is our children, where we know that our children's rights are not being rendered properly. And we've got so many instances of children missing because of not getting access to health facilities, etc. And now we've got people now doing the lost to follow up. But now, within that, how does this support the child, the children, within this charter? Maybe try and unpack that a bit, probably how you saw it.
Oh, thank you so much for that. The charter says that the best interests of the child are a priority and must be recognized and be given effect to. And out of interest, that comes from Section 28 of our Constitution, because Section 28 says that in any matter involving a child, the best interests of the child are paramount. So it's a standard that has been established. So let's look at it practically. Think about a basic thing like the birth of a child. There needs to be a facility where a pregnant mother can safely give birth to a child. One of the major hospitals in Gauteng, where maternity services have been offered for quite a long time, is the hospital we now call the Rahima Musa Mother and Child Hospital. And I know that because my two children were born there. And when they were born, the last child was born there around 12 years ago. It was a great hospital. And you would have confidence and have no doubt at all that your child will be born safely, the mother will be safe, and that both mother and child would live. But I think it was last year, if not the year before, we read about the challenges that were being experienced in that hospital. The services in that hospital had gone so bad, and there was a huge outcry about that. So that's where it begins with the child. Are they born in a good space? Are they born in such a way that they're healthy and they can expect to live a normal life? Then let's move to something very important, the registration of the birth of that child. That is a responsibility of our Department of Home Affairs. Now, if a child's birth is not registered, their vulnerability is increased by a factor of 100, if not more, because it means that they will not have a birth certificate. It means that they probably, yes, may join a primary school, they may be able to go through schooling, but by the time they complete their grade 7 and are moving on to grade 8, they will have problems with accessing high school education. It's going to become worse if they try to access tertiary education. Now, what about things like a social welfare grant, the child support grant? A child will not be able to access a CSG, child support grant, if they have no means of registration, if there's no birth certificate. They will not, because there's no record of them. What about an ID when they turn 16? So the rights of the child, in many ways, are severely compromised if the systems that we've put in place to ensure that they, for instance, are registered, are not functioning. And it is things like that that the Charter aims to give much more emphasis about.
The following one is the right to privacy, because we know that in South Africa, it's disclosure as a disclosure, and people finding about their statuses. Probably you just find out about you are positive, and someone already discloses your status without your consent. But now within this charter, we are talking about the right to privacy. How was your views pertaining the element that was written, the clause that was written pertaining the right to privacy?
We can look at, or we should rather look at privacy in multiplicity of ways. Much more broadly, even outside the realm of healthcare, for instance. But just to touch on what you've talked about, disclosure, I think we're lucky that about 25 years into the activism on HIV and AIDS, there is not as much stigma as used to be there. When I began many years back to engage with the TSC and NAPWA, National Association of People Living with AIDS, there was serious stigma against people with HIV and AIDS. And it took tremendous effort by individuals, HIV and AIDS activists, NGOs, virtually everyone who wished to see a change, to challenge and to begin to bring down those levels of stigma. But now, it doesn't mean that the stigma is gone. And say if someone approaches a healthcare facility and they're going to fetch their ARVs, we want that person to feel confident that not everybody who is sitting in that clinic would, say, be aware of their status. Some people don't mind that their status is public. Many other people, because there's still a measure of stigma attached, don't want that to be made public. But from what I've heard and from what at least I know from engaging with the sector is that sometimes there is a special room at the healthcare facility where those who collect their ARVs go to do that. So everybody knows they're Tshepo, there's Kimani, they're collecting their ARVs, and obviously they must be HIV positive. We want to protect the dignity and the privacy of everyone. But let's quickly move out of healthcare to the broader realm of privacy. Everyone has a right to privacy. That's in our constitution. And the reason why we so jealously guard privacy is that the right to privacy is connected to another very fundamental right. By law, you can't just call me names, because then the law says that you're defaming me and I have a right to approach the court and the court to protect me. But think, for instance, of the modern technologies, including the ones we are using, say, here in this recording. People are able to access our information with ease. They can hack onto computer systems or online systems, and they'll get all the information that they need. And that's why we need the law, or a law that says you just cannot access someone's private information. And if you do, you must have a reasonable basis to do that and a lawful reason to do that. And when you process that information, you must process it lawfully. And that's why we have what we call the POPI Act, Protection of Personal Information Act, which is a very important piece of legislation, protecting personal information. So we need to protect that information, because by doing that, we are also protecting the right to privacy, and by extension, the right to human dignity, which all of us have as human beings. And that is why we find that the right to privacy, and we need more people to understand how this right works in practice. We need to understand the reason why the right to privacy has made appearance in the Human Rights Charter. But more importantly, we need as many people as possible to understand how the right to privacy works. And if maybe I could just say, I think every person who has a cell phone today has at some point received a call from someone who's trying to sell them something. I can tell you I get very irritated when I get those calls. But I do realize that someone is trying to do their job. But also I do have a right to privacy. I don't want at 6 o'clock in the evening to receive a call from an AI-generated computer system trying to sell me insurance. How did they get hold of my number? That's a question. Because the law says that my number is private and may not be used in any way in which I don't consent. It's
which is being given by a third party.
It's probably been given by a third party. It could very well be that it's somewhere on the internet, a website, for instance, and my number is on the web. But I have not given consent to every insurance company or every marketing company to call me and market their products to me. When my number appears on the web, when your number appears there, when the contact number of any person appears on the internet, it's not an invitation to the whole world to call you. It's merely there for a particular reason. Perhaps it was there because you needed certain individuals to be able to contact you. Not everyone.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I think it literally covers that we have our own right as an individual to our privacy. And we really need to take role that whoever calls us must respect our privacy. But within that, this is just the last one, because I think the call to action, and I think this plays a critical role in having to us to understand this call to action and what pertaining the call to action that you saw pertaining the call to action when you went into that within the charter.
Thank you so much. That's very important and it's fundamental. The charter identifies certain stakeholders. So it identifies government, it identifies the private sector, it identifies individuals, it identifies communities, it identifies organized civil society. And all this, the charter says, are role players. So for instance, government, the charter says, has an obligation to ensure that the rights that are spelled out in the charter, which rights are derived from the Constitution, are given effect to, and that there are mechanisms for the enjoyment of those rights. So one example would be if I am trying to access certain information, we have a law in this country called the Promotion of Access to Information Act. It says that I may access any information that affects my right or in which I have an interest. And that means that I can go to any individual or any body meaning, say, a juristic person, and if they're holding information pertaining to me, I can say to them, can I access that information? So we do what's called a PAIA request, and they give me that information. Should they refuse, because it happens that entities and bodies and everyone else will refuse, then I am able to go to court. And so the charter, by saying that government must ensure that these rights are realized, also means that there must be a justice system that's well resourced by government to enable us to realize these rights. When it comes to organized civil society, I'm talking about NGOs, for instance, civil society organizations. The charter says that they have an obligation to publicize, popularize, communicate, bring the information that is in the charter to as wide a constituency as possible. And the reason why organized civil society is so important is that in most cases, civil society is much more closer to the ground, sometimes even compared to government. government at most descend to the level of local government. But that is still not far enough. I mean, in our rural areas, we probably will have traditional leaders and traditional authorities. But still, that doesn't mean that the lowest, by lowest I mean at the level of community, that person is able, say, to access the information that's required or government services. And that's where organized civil society comes in. Individuals themselves, you and I and every other person in this country, we too have an obligation to ensure that those rights, which are so well spelled out in the Charter, have meaning. It would be meaningless to have a charter with all sorts of rights, but the most vulnerable, the people that would benefit from this charter, don't know of this charter or don't know of the rights that the charter talks about. And perhaps even more fundamentally, that those rights that the charter talks to are not realized in practice by those who need them most. And by these, I'm talking about the key populations, people with HIV and AIDS, women, children, migrant communities, refugees, populations like that.
Mr. Kimani, you said a mouthful. And I hope that this can literally be driven to how you said it into communities, that it can literally have a powerful instant in us joining hands going forward. Without that, thank you for joining us today. And within today's show, we had a mouthful pertaining the Human Rights Charter. And here is what Mr. Kimani has said today, is that you as a person, what I got from him, I learned a lot today, is you as a person, you've got a right to your access, you've got a right to your information, and you've got a right to learn, and you've got a right to ensure that your child gets protected. And you've got a right to stand for your rights in healthcare facilities. And without that, please ensure that you be able to follow us on all social media platforms at @SANEC_trust, and ensure that you make sure that follow us for our next episode. And don't forget, like and follow and share. Thank you.